guys, it's Godbars here, the self-proclaimed, completely unqualified hip-hop historian, and this is the fourth episode in my series where I grab an album from my collection, talk about why I love it, what influence it has, and what its place is in the grand scheme of hip-hop. Today, I'm continuing the trend of making the first 10 albums I talk about all personal favorites of mine. Only Built for Cuban Linx holds a similar place in my heart as Low End Theory because they were both very early in my hip-hop journey. I really got introduced to this album through the Boondocks, which also introduced me to MF Doom, and has to have one of the best music selections of any cartoon, maybe any show ever. If you're unfamiliar with this album, or Raekwon the Chef, or Ghostface Killah in general, it'd be criminal to not give a bit of backstory. Some might be wondering why I didn't do the Wu-Tang debut, 36 Chambers, because that one is just so synonymous with hip-hop, and it's kind of like Illmatic and Ready to Die, where I definitely want to cover them. I'm going to cover them relatively early. I just didn't want to start with those. I wanted to start with ones that aren't quite as commonly talked about. But I do still want to do those classics relatively early in like the first leg of this channel because I don't want to get to like, my 200th video and then do Illmatic and All Eyes on Me. It makes more sense to kind of do that as a baseline, but I just didn't want to start with those. But I really want to emphasize that hip hop isn't the tiny enclosed genre that some people think it is. And I feel like they treat it that way because they only know like half a dozen rappers. And then if those guys aren't putting anything out, they just say, oh, there's nothing good's come out this year, or hip hop's dead. Both types of hip hop are worth covering, but there's so many videos on Illmatic compared to the probably like 3 videos on a group like Cloud Dead. I really want to combat the notion that you'll see on pretty much any old hip hop video where all the comments are littered by people saying that hip hop is dead today and that whatever time that classic from was so much better. Like, for example, I guarantee if you go to some old Ultramagnetic MC song and went to the comments, you'd probably see people complaining about how they don't make hip hop like this anymore when Kool Keith from Ultramagnetic has released at least like 24 albums in the last decade alone. I'm getting a bit off topic though. While Wu-Tang is like Tribe, where it feels so synonymous with hip-hop that we forget a lot of people don't know anything about these acts, besides I feel like it makes sense to just give general background for the artist or whatever album I'm covering. And while this isn't technically a Wu-Tang Clan release by the entire group, it's hard to convey the importance and influence of Ray and Ghost without giving the context of Wu-Tang Clan. Well, I'll give the whole group a more proper deep dive when I get to 36 Chambers. Raekwon and Ghostface were 2 standout members in a crew full of talented MCs. While Wu-Tang is famous for having a ridiculously good ratio of dope to whack rappers for such a huge group, personally my favorite member has always been Ghostface. I was actually initially going to talk about Iron Man in place of this album, but when I thought about it, I slightly prefer Cuban Linx. I probably would have had Supreme Clientele over both of them if I had it, but like I mentioned before, that's one of the few albums that's one of my favorite albums ever that I don't have on vinyl. The best I can find currently is one used one on Amazon that's like $700, and I don't love the album that much. And while I'd put 36 Chambers probably a little higher than Cuban Linx on my personal ranking, that's only because 36 Chambers is the best Wu-Tang release, period. Another really underrated Wu-Tang affiliated album that I wanted to at least give a shout out to is ODB's second album, which is probably also in my top 5 favorite Wu-Tang solo projects. I think it's super underrated. While Cuban Linx is technically under Raekwon's name, this is one of the multiple times him and Ghostface have shared the stage for a whole album, with one of them being featured on the vast majority of the other's project. Cuban Linx is pretty much always referred to as a Raekwon and Ghostface album compared to just a Raekwon the Chef album. They're up there with Q-Tip and Phife when it comes to vocal and lyrical chemistry. Their New York street slang and subject matter matches each other, but their voices and flows provide a bit of contrast. Ray has a concise, straightforward flow and deeper register that fits his storytelling, and it's never hard to make out what he's saying. On the other hand, Ghostface has one of the most recognizable voices in hip-hop, and a personal favorite of mine, which is very expressive and animated. He's a master storyteller too, but he has a seemingly never-ending index of references and places that he can sort of switch around to create a new interesting story. I also initially fell in love with a lot of Ghostface's verses on here, not just because of the flow and the way he delivers it, but the way that they're structured is really interesting. He writes in a way where his verses just kind of unwind and develop, and it kind of puts him in a class like Doom, where I feel like if you're a rapper and or writer, you might slightly appreciate what he's doing a little more. These vocal, lyrical, and stylistic choices are just some of the reasons that he's pretty much always been neck and neck with Doom for me in my overall favorite rapper of all time ranking. Billy Woods has long been my favorite current rapper, and LP would probably grab like the third or fourth spot of my favorite somewhere, but for a long time it's pretty much been Doom and Ghostface. I can't begin to express how disappointed I am that we never got the Doomstarks album, but that's neither here nor there. The thing with those iconic Ghost and Ray flows is it's on all of their classic albums together. They have that chemistry on Bulletproof Wallets, Iron Man, and even to a degree on the debut. The thing that really separates Only Built for Cuban Links from these is the story that's crafted through the skits, lyrical references, and featured artists acting as characters in the movie. That's really how this album plays to me. While it may not be considered directly a concept album, it really plays like one. I'm not really going to get into the details of the story because that's something I feel like you should get yourself listening to the album, but it's kind of like the plot of a movie like Belly. A big component of this album and pretty much all the solo Wu-Tang albums of this era was RZA. For anyone not in the know, he is the resident producer for Wu-Tang Clan and made all the classic beats for both their group and solo projects up until a certain point. He famously had one of the most unrivaled production runs in hip-hop from 93 to 96. Just some of the albums he either had a hand in producing or fully produced, most of them he fully produced just in that little span of years. It's Only Built for Cuban Links, 6 Feet Deep by Gravediggers, along with Prince Paul, Method Man to Cal, Ghostface Iron Man, Jizza Liquid Swords, and ODB's debut. While he brought absolutely top tier instrumentals to all these projects, he arguably brought the tightest and most packed track list of all for Cuban Links. This is one of those albums that has a pretty crazy amount of iconic beats, at least in my head. Guillotine Swords, Glaciers of Ice, and Ice Cream, just to name a few. This album really has every type of song you could want. The amount of ground RZA manages to cover with these flips is a huge testament to how gifted he is as a producer. Together, they really managed to create a vivid, if grimy world here that still has these rays of optimism and hope throughout. And there's also top tier Wu affiliated features from rappers like You God, Blue Raspberry, Inspector Deck, Jizza, Capadonna, Nas, Method Man, RZA, and Masta Killa. Overall, this album was an absolute game changer for hip hop, and it really opened the door for me to hearing a lot of the other classic solo Wu-Tang projects, again, many of which I'll cover pretty soon on this channel. I'm gonna try to stop saying how hard it is to pick my 3 favorite songs because it's gonna get redundant and it's always gonna be hard. For this classic, those 3 would have to be Guillotine Swords, Glaciers of Ice, and Verbal Intercourse. But honestly, this one is so full of amazing songs. I kind of have to have a couple of honorable mentions. We have Criminology, Heaven and Hell, Rainy Days, and Ice Cream. And still, the 3 favorites are the ones I named, but if you haven't heard any of those other 4, you really should because all of those really could have just as easily been in the top 3. You could pretty much switch any of those songs around and nobody would look at you sideways for having those as your favorites. Thank you for watching my 4th video. The next one is going to be another early 90s album, a little earlier than this one. So if you want to see that, be sure to check in and like, subscribe, leave a comment, all that stuff. Be sure to leave what your favorite songs are from this album and what albums or artists you're interested in having me cover. And I'll try to get around to them. Okay? All right.